Welcome to this part 3 of Class 4, Maya 312. In this part of the class, we're going to start looking at our alpha channels for our candle flames. So inside of Nuke, just check your settings straight away by tapping S on the keyboard from the node graph, and make sure you're set to 25 FPS. Let's make a read node by tapping R on the keyboard, and let's find our flame HDR image sequence and hit open. Tap 1 on the keyboard to view that. And what we want to do is create an alpha channel from the brightest part of this image, which is the candle flame. A good way to do that is using a luma key. So let's hit tab on the keyboard, create a keyer node, drop that down, and switch over to the alpha channel. Now this image has got quite a lot of range in it, so I'm going to zoom out on our viewer here, and drag over our D slider and our C slider, and now slowly slide over our B slider until we lose quite a lot of that background detail. And then pull over our A slider to define the range. So we've lost all of that information from the background. Let's check it out on a few more frames. So it's looking pretty good overall. A good way to check this out is drop down a pre-mult node and view that and switch back to RGB. Now we want to soften off this edge a little bit, so between the luma key and the pre-mult, let's drop down a blur node, again tab on the keyboard, type blur. And we're only going to blur the alpha channel, so let's blur that just enough so we're seeing some nice information on the edges. Okay, so we've got a nice candle flame. So let's pull down the pre-mult, and between the blur and the pre-mult, let's drop down a shuffle node. So tab on the keyboard and shuffle. And we're going to shuffle our alpha channel into our red channel. Tap 1 on the keyboard to view that shuffle. And now we're going to disconnect everything from the input layer to the output layer. We're going to connect our alpha channel input layer to our red output layer. So now we have our alpha channel in our red channel. Let's delete this pre-mult because we don't need that. And you'll see that in the alpha channel, there's nothing in here. There's nothing in green. There's nothing in blue. All of our alpha data is stored in our red channel. So let's write this out. W on the keyboard to create a write node. Channels are RGB, which is absolutely fine. Let's come in and find our flame HDR image sequence. We can remove the sequence numbers from the end. And instead of this being called HDR, we call this alpha. Hit save. Let's write an ACES compliant EXR and hit render. Make sure we've got the correct frame range and continue on error is turned off. And let's hit OK. Okay, great. So to view the result, I'm going to tap R on the keyboard, come and find that alpha, hit open, hit 1 on the keyboard to view that, and we can see that we've got all of our alpha information in the red channel of this image. So let's jump back over to Maya. And here inside Maya, what we want to do is apply our candle flames to some cards. So I'm going to create 2 cards. Let's come to Polygon Primitives, and underneath Plane, let's make sure that we've got our width and height division set to 1. Hit Create. Let's go to the perspective camera. And first thing that we want to do is rotate these 90 degrees. So in the x-axis, I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. Let's pull this up into our scene so we can see it a little more clearly. Okay. Now I'm going to call this flame card _01. Now I'm going to duplicate this by pressing Ctrl D on the keyboard and call this flame card offset. So we want to add a bit of variation into our scene, and I think a good way of doing that is to offset the candle flame sequence. And if we use an offset frame number on our hero candle, it'll look different to the other ones. So I'm going to select our standard card, right click, and assign new material. And all we want is a surface shader, a Maya surface shader. I'm going to copy the name of that card, come over and find that surface shader, and paste that in. So flame card _SHD for shader. And on this card, I want to right click, assign new material, create a completely separate shader, copy the name of that card, come on over and find that surface shader, paste that in, offset, shader. Okay. So with these two selected, let's go to the hypershade. Let's clear out what we had in here before. Graph both of these, select the shading groups, and graph those. So here's our offset shader, and here's our standard shader. So into the flame card standard shader, let's go over to textures, find our flame HDR, drag that in. And all we need to do is take the out color and connect it to the color. Let's hit tab on the keyboard, create another file, file texture. Okay. And this is going to make up our alpha channel. So let's click on the file, and let's come into our folder inside of source images and select any one of our alpha frames. I'm now going to drop down a reverse node, so tab on the keyboard, reverse, and this is going to reverse the colors for us. We're going to take the out color from our alpha and plug it into the reverse node. And we're going to take the output X from our reverse node, drop down underneath the transparency of our surface shader, and that X is going to go into the R, G, and B of our transparency. Come back to that file node and make sure image sequence is turned on. Now it lines up nicely. Okay. Let's expand this out a little bit. And we want to manipulate the color of this slightly. It's looking a little bit pale. So let's drop down a multiply node, multiply divide, and take the out color, plug that into input 2, output to out color. It now, of course, goes completely black. So let's drop down a ramp, ramp texture, take the out color, plug it into input 1. Let's delete all of the black from this ramp. Let's go and find a nice orangey candle color. Dial in a little bit of saturation there. And we've got a nice orange color. Maybe we could darken that off, drop the saturation a little bit, but just to fill it in, it looks nice. Okay, so we want to take the same ramp and plug it into the card offset. So again, a multiply divide. Let's take the output and plug it into the out color of our surface shader. And let's take our ramp and plug that into input 1. Now let's drop down a fresh file node, file texture. Plug that color into input 2 of the multiply divide. And in this file, I'm going to go ahead and take any one of the frames from our flame HDR, hit open. But in this node, we're going to turn on use image sequence and offset the frame number by something like 20. We rendered a lot of additional frames at the end of this, so 20 frame offset is going to be absolutely fine. And we need to repeat the process for the alpha. So let's drop down a file node, file texture. Again, go in and find any one of the frames from our alpha channel, hit open. We need to take a reverse node. Let's take the color, put it into input. Getting a little bit messy in here now, so let's drag these over. Take the output X and the transparency, and that goes into R, G, and it also goes into B. Then our alpha node, this needs to be an image sequence, and again, offset by 20. Okay, let's just make sure that our output X is connected to the transparency B as well. All right, so that's looking pretty good. So let's go back to our scene view. And that's obvious here. So in the offset card and then the standard card, if we play through the timeline, we've got a little bit of variation. And that's looking quite nice. So let's take our flame card and let's duplicate that to all of the candles in the scene except our foreground candle. So let's move that over and we'll start with this candle here on the right hand side. Pull it up a little bit, scale it down. We can move this over. And then using Control D on the keyboard, I'm just going to duplicate this and copy it over. Again, Control D, copy that over. Then the same for the background candles, Control D, utilizing V on the keyboard to snap it. Control D to duplicate, and Control D to duplicate. Alright. Then for our hero candle, the one with the frame offset, let's translate that into position. Again, utilizing V on the keyboard to help me there. This being our hero flame, let's have a look through the render camera. Okay, so obviously too bright right now, so let's bring that down. Okay, probably needs to just move up a little bit. And could be a touch smaller. Okay, so that's great. So let's group those. Let's call that flames underscore GRP. Let's create a render layer for those. Underneath beauty, we've got this untitled collection, so let's just delete that. Let's add in a new layer. Let's call this flames underscore BTY. And let's view that. So we've got our lights in here straight away, so we want to hide those. So let's select the light group, create a collection, we'll call this lights underscore hide. Middle click and drag, put a wildcard on the top. And now selecting our lights group, let's go over to the attributes, find display, right click, set absolute override for visible layer, and turn the visibility off. So now our lights are hidden. We of course want our flames in here, so let's create a collection. We'll call this flames underscore CL. Drag this over, put a wildcard on there too. Now that includes all of our flames. And then the objects, we want to use this as a matte. So let's go to create collection. We'll call this asset matte. Drag those objects over here. Wildcard. And then selecting any one of these polygon objects, for example, the visor. In the shape, let's go down to Arnold, right click on matte, create absolute override for visible layer, and turn that on. Okay, so now all of the objects in the scene are going to matte out our candles. So let's go back to our render view. Render and update full scene. So there we have our candles. Let's just ensure that our matte's working correctly. So when the candles pass behind the helmet, we should only have 2 of them visible here. Let's double check. Okay, perfect, so that's looking good. I think what we want to do now is set things up and render out a sequence. Now let's head over to our render settings and let's just get all of these squared away. So the first thing that we want to do is scroll down. At the moment we've got this set to HD 720, and I think for the purposes of this course, I think that's going to be enough resolution for us. We don't need to worry about anything underneath the scene assembly or the further render options down here. Let's make sure that we've got our renderable camera set to render cam. We want to change our frame animation extension to name.hash.extension, and this is going to give us a sequence. A single frame of padding is going to be absolutely fine for this. We want our start frame to, of course, be 1001. We want our end frame to be 1050. Okay, so that's going to give us the full frame range. Let's turn half precision off, and we'll leave half precision off for this render. Underneath the Arnold render, let's go back in and adjust some of our samples here. So it's going to be a slightly noisy render if we don't adjust these, so I think we want to keep our diffuse on something like 1, specular on something like 2. Let's make sure that our SSS is cranked up. We're going to want this on something like 7. Maybe turn our camera AA up to 5, and in our adaptive sampling, let's push this to 8. Underneath clamping, let's turn on clamp samples and affect AOVs. We're not going to be using AOVs, but we'll turn it on for now. We'll leave that clamp at something like 7 for both. And underneath the ray depth, I think we want to make sure that our transmission is set to something like 2. We don't need too many samples in here. 2 and then 1 in the specular and 1 in diffuse. And let's keep that as a total of 4. Let's close that out. I don't think we need to render with motion blur. I don't think the camera's moving particularly quickly. Underneath our lights, originally we had this set to 0.01, and we'll keep that as 0.01. This is going to help our render times. Auto convert to TX is fine. Everything in our scene is already TX'd as we've been rendering, so that's okay. So underneath system, we don't need to do very much on here. We're going to be rendering on the CPU. Let's scroll down, and let's just make sure that we've got render with watermarks. And we're going to turn that off and make sure that we don't render with the Arnold logo. AOVs, I don't think we need to touch AOVs. This is just a beauty render in this course. And underneath diagnostics, let's leave this all to the default. So the main settings that we've got here are image format as EXR. We've turned half precision off and we're going to be rendering tiled. The color space is the same as our output transform. And we've got 1 frame of padding. We've dialed in our frame range. We're rendering with the render cam and we're rendering at 720. And we're going to keep these render settings for all of the render layers. Let's head back to the Arnold render. With the render cam selected, let's go to render and update full scene. Okay, we can use our render region tool to just check out how much noise we're going to get on this candle here in the foreground. Okay, so a better noise level there, but I think we can go back in and dial in a couple more samples into the lights before we hit render. So let's close out our render settings, and I think the lights that we want to be working with here are the one that's pointing towards our beast. And this one we can probably have on 3 now. And our downward light, the one that's pointing down, let's move this up to 5. We can also have it contribute slightly less SSS as well, so we can probably bring this down to something like 7. Alright, so let's go back to the Arnold render view, see what that looks like. Okay, so that's a more acceptable level of noise. So let's go ahead and prepare to render out a sequence. Let's come over to the render tab. I'm going to scroll down and find render sequence. Look at the settings under here. Okay, so this is going to render our render cam. All enabled layers is checked. So let's go on to our render layers editor here and let's drag this out so we can see what we're doing. And at the moment, because our default layer is blue, this is going to render as well. So let's make sure that that's turned off. Okay, and we've got these two ready to render here. So if we right click and hit set renderable, you see how we can turn them on and off. We want both of these on. All right, so let's close that out. We want to render all our enabled cameras. Well, we only have one render camera, so that's absolutely fine. Render region is disabled. Ignore local overrides is also off. And we want to render to our images directory, so we don't need to put anything in here. We also don't need to add our images to the render view. So all that's left to do is render sequence and close. Okay, so depending on the specification of your system, that may have taken longer or less time to render. But here we are in Nuke, and let's take a look at the results. I want to do a little bit of compositing. We'll render that out, and we'll take a look at the outcome altogether. Okay, so I'm going to tap R on the keyboard from the node editor. Let's come in and find our images directory, and we want beauty, which is rendered out here. Tap next, flames beauty, select that and hit open. This is going to drop down 2 read nodes. We've got the beauty on the left and we've got the flames on the right. I'm going to hit M on the keyboard to create a merge node, and I'm going to tap the period key to create a dot. I'm going to attach B to the dot and then the dot to the beauty layer, and then A to the flames. Double click on our merge, change the operation to plus, view the result. Let's make sure that our viewer is in Rec 709 Aces. Okay. If we gain up, we can see that we've got our rendered sequence in here. That's looking pretty good. Let's do a little bit of work on the flames, do a grade overall, and we'll take a look at the outcome. So the first thing that I want to do is add some glows to the flames. But when they intersect with the edge of frame, it might cause some strange artifacts. So I want to overscan these 2 renders first. And we can do that by dropping down a reformat node, bring that underneath, switching resize type from width to none, and then the type to scale, and let's put in 20%, so 1.2. Let's make sure we've got black outside turned on, and now I'm going to drop down a crop node with that reformat selected, and turn black outside off. Now we're managing our bounding box quite nicely. Copy these two nodes, take the A input of our plus, connect it to the crop, take the reformat, connect it to our flames, tap one on the keyboard on our plus merge node, and we can view the results. Okay, so now let's drop down a couple of nodes. Let's drop down a glow, tab on the keyboard, and let's create glow. Okay, so this is pretty good already. Let's turn the brightness up a little bit. Maybe we can adjust the size as well. Let's put down a blur underneath this, just to smooth it all out a little bit. Let's give ourselves some room. Let's put another glow on the bottom of here, and we can make this much bigger. So we've got some nice glowing candles here. We can also increase the brightness of that. And let's put down a glow on the bottom of this as well to give us a more atmospheric effect. So the size can be something like 200, and the brightness we can dial all the way up. Okay, and we can see that the glow is going outside of the edge of our frame, and this is going to work nicely when we reformat at the end. Let's do a little grade, so tapping G on the keyboard to grade our flames. Let's bring the gain down a little bit. Okay, maybe the gamma up. So that's working quite nicely for us. We can see that we've lost a bit of saturation here. So in the grade node, underneath gain, let's make this a little bit warmer. As warm as we dare. Okay, good. Maybe we can reduce our blur just a little bit. Bring back a bit more definition there. Let's adjust our grade overall by dropping down another grade node here. And we can adjust our black point. We're going to have nothing else in this comp, so we don't need to put down an unpremult prenult at the end of these. So let's just adjust our black point over here on the right hand side. And if we wanted to punch in maybe something like a little bit more blue, we can do that here from the field on the left hand side. Okay, I think we should gain up overall. Something like that, and then to give a little bit more contrast we can bring the gamma down a little bit, not too much. It might be nice to just knock a bit of the saturation out of the image, so let's drop down a color correct, put that here, view that, and just reduce the saturation a little bit. So now let's drop down a reformat node at the end to take off that overscan. So switching the resize type to none, to format is to 720, which if you tap S on the keyboard is the same as our 4 size reformat. Let's drop down a crop node just to make sure that our bounding box doesn't have any extra information in it. Let's scrub through the timeline. Press W on the keyboard to drop down a right node. Let's click on the file. And we've got a nuke directory here that I've created, but you can store this anywhere you like. And let's call this comps. Let's call this something like character underscore comp underscore 01 underscore v002 dot hash dot exr. That way we get some frame padding. Let's hit save. Let's write out an ACES compliant EXR. Come down to render. Our input frame range is absolutely fine. Continue on error is turned off. Let's hit OK. Okay, so let's drop down a read node. Let's pull that back in. So R on the keyboard and then selecting the sequence and hitting open. Let's view that by pressing 1 on the keyboard. Let's close out the properties panel. Come over to the viewer, tap space on the keyboard to go to almost full screen. And let's play this through. Allow it to cache first. Okay, so that's playing back quite nicely. And we can see that we've got loads of nice flickering from our candles in here, giving a nice realistic result. We've got a candle in the foreground that's got a nice bit of variation on it. And then we've got our beast with the SSS and the SSS and the candle reacting properly. And then we've got all the nice details and the glass smash on our visor, all using real-life HDR images. So I think one last thing that I might want to do is just preview this with a vignette. So let's hit stop. We'll come down and find our render. Now we can call this our, let's say, pre-comp. I'm going to drop down an exposure node because I want to underexpose part of the image. Let's create a roto shape, tab on the keyboard and roto. Let's connect the roto shape to the exposure. Okay. Double click on the roto node and switch clip type to no clip. Output alpha is absolutely fine. Over here on the left hand side, let's drop down underneath this menu and find ellipse. Let's come back to the first frame. Let's draw an ellipse over the center of our image. Move it over a little bit, something like that. Now with this selected, let's grab these little feather handles on the edge, pull those out to the edge of the image. We can use the Bezier handles as well to help us out. Extend that over the corners. Something a bit like this. Okay. Let's close out the properties panel for that. Double click on the exposure. And down here underneath mask, let's invert the roto shape and underexpose the corners of our image. Now we want to get a nice fall off, so double click on the roto, click on our ellipse shape, smooth, close out the properties panel. Let's take our right node, plug that into our exposure. We'll give this a new version, version 2. Let's go ahead and write this out. And tap R on the keyboard, find that version 2, read that in. Tap 1, come up to the viewer, tap spacebar. Let's allow this to cache. Yeah, there you go, nice. A nice little vignette on there. So let's return to the first frame and talk about what we've created here. So we started out the process by creating the lights to go on top of the astronaut's helmet from a bracket of images. We compiled that into a HDR light map, and we've applied that to some area lights, and that's what's creating the beams coming off his helmet. We then created a live action HDR of the candle flame, and that live action HDR is not only contributing to the image of the candle flame, but it's also contributing to the lighting effects in the scene. So you have to be able to get realistic candle lighting effects using a realistic candle HDR. It makes sense. And this is the result. All the materials are reacting correctly, the SSS in the candles, the SSS in the beast. We're even getting some nice volume shadows in here as well. So thanks for joining me for this part of the course. I hope that you enjoyed it. I know that I enjoyed creating it for you. And I hope to see you in the next class when we take on some slightly different challenges.